Cubase 14 brings the possibility to use probability and velocity variance in your sequencing to make effectively your sequencing more interesting with the computer doing the work. This is something which has been kind of possible with the logical editor for a long time, something I've been banging on about for a very long time, but now it's integrated straight into the user interface. So let's take a look. So probability and variance is something which has made its way into Cubase at long last, and it allows you to avoid having to do a lot of the complicated kind of programming which I've been eschewing for the past million years. So there's some interesting stuff you can do. There's some slightly more interesting stuff you can do in the pattern editor for the drum track, which is also available for other kind of tracks as well, as we will see. So stay tuned even if you've watched that, but it's available in the key editor, which is it's quite nice. So firstly, we're going to look at probability. So I've got the world's most amazing piece of music available here, which I'm hoping you're going to like my new composition. So yeah, you get the idea with that. Now, what we can do is decide maybe there's one of these notes we don't always want to hear. So let's say we don't always want to hear the B. So we can go to here and we get two new kinds of tracks. Now, it's important to highlight that this is only available in Cubase Pro and Cubase Artist. So if you have Elements or LE or AI, these do not appear. I've checked this. So we're going to look at play probability. We'll look at variance later on. And by default, as you'd expect, the probability of a note playing is 100%. You could make some joke about bugs, but generally, if you put a note in, it will play. But we can change it. So let's say we'll change this B. We're going to change it to less than 50%. So hopefully half the time and more, we won't hear it. And just go back to the beginning and play it. And this time, hopefully we won't hear the B. And you can see you get this little sort of cross-hatching on there. So you can see, even if you haven't got this lane open, you'll know something tricky maybe applied to that note. So that time it played. And that time it played. This is the nature of randomness. So there you go. So if we played it 100 times, we should see 36 playings with it, 64 without. You get the idea. So you can extend this. So let's say sometimes you want this to be a C major 7 chord with the B on top, and other times you just want it to be a plain old C major without. You can do exactly the same. So half the time, let's make it half the time because it... Oh, is he going to do it? There we go. Oh, no, he managed 49. Anyway, that's close enough. So now when we play this, some of the time, we get a C major. Some of the time, we get a C major 7. And that will happen randomly. In my testing, it does happen randomly. It's not repeatable. So if you do a mix down with one, it will be like that one way. And then the next time you do it, it will be different again. If that's a problem for you, then you would need to turn these into concrete events with 100% probability. I quite like the fact that it's a bit different each time, but I'm not making massive musical changes with it. But it's quite nice to have. Next, we can look at how you can use this for something a bit more musical. So on this next track, I've got some slightly more interesting chords, I think you'll agree, straight out of chord pads. So, you know, nice enough kind of thing. But here I've got some variations, and some of these are a little bit more interesting in terms of their harmony. You know, there's a bit more interest going on, and the kind of thing you'd develop as a song went on, possibly. So there's some nice tensions within those. Now, you may not want them to appear all the time. And if you are, let's say, keyboard skills challenged, as certainly I know I am, you may not be able to play those throughout the entirety of a song and just do what a musician might do all the time, where they would just build that or change it as we go, particularly on a longer thing where you've got maybe vamping around these chords for ages. You can emulate that with this. So here I've got a version where we've got all of those notes present, and it's this tension between the E and the F within the middle of the chord I think is really interesting. It gives a real nice sound to that chord, but I may not always want it. So again, you can do that here as well. So you don't have to do it down here. We've got play probability on the info line, so I can just bring it down here. So let's make that 50%. And it's adjusting it in tens. I think if I hold down Shift, I can also adjust it within every percentage. But let's just say I want it to be 50% of the time for that. And also we've got this tension here. So I'm just going to take this A and do the same with that. Make that 50%. And now when we play this, see that time it played, and this time, hopefully it won't. Or it will. Yeah, so you can hear that second one played. Yeah. So it's coming and going. It works nicely for that. It's the kind of thing I would do on more subtle things, because if you make it really obvious, like the example with the major scale, if it doesn't happen where you want it in a particular mix, then you may need to go back and fix that. But I think for subtle changes like this, where you've got these variations which are happening subtly and hopefully not imperceptibly, but the kind of things that add interest without sticking out like a sore thumb, I think it's quite useful for doing that. Say, particularly when you're working on your own, you may not be, Mr. Keyboards, whereas plenty of the keyboard players I know who I'd worked with, I'd say, just mix it up a bit and they'd know exactly what to do. But this allows you to do this programmatically, which is quite nice. Now let's move on to velocity variance. So the other thing the eagle-eyed amongst you may have noticed is that there is another lane available here and also in the info line at the top. It's velocity variance. So this allows you to choose how much the velocity of a given note will vary. So again, this is something I've been rattling on about for the past, actually it is 30 years, to make programming sound more human, which is to add in some randomness in there. Because if you get somebody, even if they're the best keyboard player in the world, and I have actually done this with some amazing players, get them to play exactly the same mid-range kind of velocity on a note, it won't be the same every time. There'll be variations in there. And you can now do this without having to put it in. You can just decide given notes can be randomly more. So here, let's say we want to use the line tool for reasons that will become apparent in a bit. We can just say, right, we want all of them to be up to 34% more. So this is based, I think, on the existing velocity. So if we go back here, we've got the velocity of these notes. We can see they're on 100. And then the velocity variance will be possibly greater than that. And when we play this back, we should hear. Yeah, so you can hear that those notes are varying in velocity. Some are slightly harder than others. Now, again, if we look at this in a little bit more detail, so if I close the editor and we have a look at the MIDI monitor I've got set up here, so we can just clear this list. If we play this back, we can see we've got 125, 127, etc. That one's 105 and so on. But you can see those random values. Now, if I play this again, we can see they are different. So it's maxing out on some of them, and it's not the same every time. So the same situation as with the note probability, we've got this velocity variance. It's not the same every time. I'd probably not make it so variable that you can hear those differences. But again, it's the kind of thing that once you've listened to these kind of things where they've got subtle variations in there, there's something in there that keeps your brain interested in something at a subconscious level. It's one of the reasons why a lot of tracks, I think, where somebody has just looped something again and again and again, doesn't seem to have that listening longevity. Whereas when it's been played throughout the entire track, as it used to be done before everybody, and myself included, just, got a 4-bar bit that was good and repeated it, they seem to have more listening longevity over a long period. I don't mean as in you'd listen to the 3 minutes and you get to the 3 minutes. I mean, there's some interest in there. There's just those little subtle variations. And this is a really quick way to achieve that. Now, a couple of times in this video, I've mentioned the fact that you may want randomness, but then you may want it to be repeatable, which sounds a bit counterintuitive, but actually that can be the case if you end up relying on a particular randomness. And if you just leave it random, it will be different each time you play your song back, which may not be a problem depending on the changes you want, but sometimes you may want to fix it. And you can do that. You can do it for the velocity variance and you can do it for the probability. So I'm just going to show you that in action because it's fairly straightforward when you know where it is. But if you don't know where it is, it may not be apparent. So here I've got a part where I've just drawn in some probability and some variance to make it really obvious when that has happened. And to apply either of these, if you've got probability visible, if you right click or 2-finger tap here, so not on this where you're going to change the controller lane view, but actually here, you get a little pop-up menu. And one of them you can see, you can apply MIDI play probability. You can also reset it here if you've made a complete pig's ear of it. But if we do apply, you'll see the probability of these notes is applied and some of them are played and some of them aren't. And we can do exactly the same with the variation of velocity. So we just right click here. Now this will be slightly off my screen capture area. In fact, let's move this up here. So let's change that to velocity variance just so you can see it. Apply MIDI velocity variance here. And now you can see at the bottom, this has got the variance and obviously only some of those notes are played. Now, if you do this on another part, the reason I had multiple parts back in the project window is because I want to show you that you get a different effect each time. So remember this, study this exactly. You'll get the idea. It'll be different enough. You'll know what's happening. But we can see we've got most of them in bar 1 and then only 1 in bar 2, 2 in bar 3. If we do the same here, so again, I'm going to do the velocity here and then do the play probability slightly off the screen, but you'll see its effect. We can see we get a different result this time. So each time you do it, you'd get a different result. You might want to do that across a large selection and then choose the random one that you wanted. But this just shows that if you do it each time, you get a different result. And in this case, we've got none in that bar and so on. So you get the idea, but that's how you do that. And then they will permanently be fixed. It's just like as if you'd played it that way and would never change. So the final thing I want to look at is the drum track editor and the fact that the pattern editor is not solely linked to the drum track. So by default, if you create a new drum track, as I have done here, when you look at the editor here we've got the drums and then we go to the editor here and here's the pattern I've just created and we've got something fairly straightforward. And you can see this one will hopefully play. Yeah, eventually. So even though that was at 64% probability, it didn't play for a while. And that, again, is the nature of randomness. It's not going to do it exactly the way you would think. It's going to come and go, but overall, it should be the right amount. And we've got velocity variance in there as well. So it's exactly the same thing as you've seen earlier on. But what I want to highlight is the fact that if you've got access to this editor, you don't need to use it with a drum track. So if I add a new track, so I'm going to add an instrument track, and instead of Halley & Sonic, I'm going to choose the Tal Noisemaker, and then pick pattern event. So you have the option of MIDI part, which is the traditional thing you'd have with most instruments, but you can pick pattern events for normal tracks, as it were. And let's just call that Wibbly Bits for reasons that will hopefully become apparent later on. Now, just going to load up a preset, which is, I think it's this one here. Yeah, I think that's about right. We'll play around with this a bit later, but it's something slightly more interesting than what we had up earlier. And now if you open up the editor in the lower zone or potentially in the main window, you've got this here. Now, What I would suggest is to remap these to something slightly more interesting, because C, C sharp, etc. isn't that interesting. So we're going to remap them to C3, and then E3, and then G3. And then I'm going to do B3, and then D4. So we're climbing up just as you would add, thirds to a chord, and then F4. So this on its own would be fairly mundane. Now, if we were to just plonk all of those in like that, every time it goes around this cycle, we would get a chord had I made the right edits to the synth. I just need to take that off of mono. I'm going to put on 6 voices just so we can hear everything. And then we get that chord, which is a bit odd sounding and a bit more interesting than it previously would have been. But that's not what I want. I don't want to just whack out a chord every single time. So what I'm going to do is change these to odd numbers. And by changing them to odd numbers, they're going to repeat differently compared to each other. So that one's going to be, let's say 11. Let's make this one let's make that one 9. This one 13. That one 17, and this one 15. And then I'm literally going to just stab a few things in here and there, and then change their probability. So let's make it so, maybe this first one is going to always happen, but the others are going to happen less often. And as we become further up the chord, as it were, and the tension increases, I'm probably going to reduce the probability of something happening. So that on its own is just... I'm not even sure where the beat is. I can see where the beat is, but it doesn't sound that way. And then just putting in, I think in this case, I'm probably just going to put one on each end of each one with a reduced probability, and say probably make them less likely to happen the further up we go. And just that on its own will start playing some... And it's going to be different every time. And obviously, maybe you'd want to put some extras in, maybe with even lower chance of them happening. That one will come up very seldom. And it's a very cheap way to generate this kind of odd repeating, but not repeating arpeggio, because if you had all of these playing all the time, I guess you'd probably pick out some of the pattern. But even if they were playing all the time, because they're at different lengths and they're cycling differently, you wouldn't have the same thing happening all the time. And it would certainly take a greater brain than mine to pick all of those out and go, oh yes, that's in 17. You'd do it eventually, but it wouldn't be something you would do on the first listen. But by having these probabilities in there, it effectively changes that length in there. And you can come up with some, say, more interesting things than just a standard arpeggiator. There are some arpeggiators, such as Blue Arp, that allow you to do this kind of thing. But this is another way of doing it with the built-in tools that are part of Cubase. And say, it's not immediately apparent where the beat it wants. Now we've just got away from it. I don't know where the beat is anymore because I was concentrating on talking. Put a bit of swing in there, etc. But I just thought it's another interesting way to do that. And you can, of course, play around with the velocity variance. So you might want to make it so some of these maybe are a little quieter. Some of them are a little louder randomly as well. And it will just add in more variation and change as this goes on. I'm sure you'll be able to do something much more interesting and creative, particularly once you start playing around with the sounds, because this is probably sound that needs a bit of playing around with to get it to sound really good. But it's also this is a great synth if you haven't got it. It's good fun to play around with. Got some nice features. Yeah, so lots of stuff to be had with this kind of thing. So that's it's much to do with the drum editor, so the pattern editor as anything else. But I thought because it's got probability is the use and variation, but probability in particular is useful here. It's either or is where I put it, and I shoved it on the end of this one. And if you don't like it being here, then you know you can sue me or something. But so there you go, probability and variance in Cubase 14. So this is something which is only available in the upper versions of Cubase, probably for good reasons, but it's certainly something which I think if you make use of it in the way it's been seen in this video, there's two ways you can get on with it. You can either improve real sequencing, particularly in terms of velocity variance, but maybe missing the odd note out as well. If you're anything like, well, probably me and many people I've played with. You can also use it for kind of generative music. So it's certainly not powerful enough to do really, really complicated stuff yet, but it's certainly something where you can experiment with it a bit and play around with it. But certainly I think it's useful to bring this kind of thing to the table because it makes it much more accessible than saying, just open up the logical editor and start doing processing like that, which while most people can do that when you show them, if you want to learn, there's a video series elsewhere on the channel, but it's the kind of thing, say, that often will make people go, oh, I'm not sure about that. And a lot of people just don't do it as a result. And that's a pity because it emulates humanity, makes things interesting, etc., as I've already said. As ever, hope you found this video useful. And if you have, please like, comment, and possibly even subscribe, or just watch every video I've ever done. If everyone watching this video did that, I'd have a great couple of months in terms of YouTube revenue. That would be wonderful. Anyway, hopefully we'll see you again soon for more Music Tech Tuition.